You've been talking to the Virgin Mary every night for weeks now. Same words, same tightness in your throat. And on the other side, nothing. Not a sign. Not even that peace people talk about when a prayer has been heard. You wonder if you prayed wrong, if your faith isn't enough, if there's something in you keeping her far away, silent, absent. A 12th century monk felt that exact same thing before he became the man who spoke more about Mary's love than anyone else in the history of the Church. And what he discovered about that silence has nothing to do with what you're thinking right now, reading this with your chest tight. His name was Bernard, and before he ever walked into the monastery at Clairvaux, he already knew that emptiness, that praying without feeling anything come back, that suspicion of talking to a wall. What he learned afterward about Mary's silence is what turned him into the saint the Church still remembers as the sweetest voice ever raised about the Mother of God. But before that sweetness, there was a question that burned inside him for years. When was the last time you asked the Virgin for something and felt deep down that the words just disappeared into nothing? Hold on to that feeling. What Bernard came to understand, he lived first. No shortcuts, no easy theories to comfort you quickly. Saint Teresa of Jesus went through something similar later in her own way, and between the two of them they left behind an inheritance that reaches all the way to this exact moment, while you wonder if anyone is listening. The monastery at Clairvaux, tucked into the frozen valley of Champagne, had none of the grandeur people imagine when they picture medieval abbeys. Bare stone, cold that got into your bones even inside the chapel. A handful of monks who had walked away from family, land, and comfort to live under a rule with no patience for laziness or pride. That's where Saint Bernard arrived, barely 23 years old, in the year 1112, dragging behind him such a large crowd of relatives and friends that the abbot of Citeaux hardly knew what to do with so many people showing up at once. Soon they'd send him off to found Clairvaux, and it was there, in that harsh place, that the part of his life history would remember most tenderly began. Because Saint Bernard ended up being called the mellifluous doctor, a title the Church does not hand out lightly. Mellifluous means flowing like honey, and he earned it for the sweetness of his writings on the Virgin Mary, for a tenderness no theologian of his time had managed to put into words quite that way. And here's what almost nobody knows: that sweetness didn't come from a comfortable life of quiet contemplation. It came from years of walking through what he himself described as an interior dryness so severe that at times he doubted whether his vocation had been a mistake. The first years at Clairvaux were brutal. Saint Bernard drove himself with a severity that ended up seriously damaging his health. Extreme fasting, entire nights spent in vigil, a pace of penance so punishing that his own superiors had to step in and slow him down, afraid he'd die before turning 30. It's said his stomach never recovered from those years of excess. He carried digestive problems for the rest of his life, and on many nights, he couldn't even manage the little food the rule allowed him. And in the middle of all that sacrifice, he prayed. He prayed to the Virgin with the intensity of a man begging for rescue. The other monks at Clairvaux would see him come out of the chapel at dawn, eyes sunken, body shaking with cold and exhaustion, but with something in his gaze they couldn't quite read. Some thought it was early sainthood. Others, the ones closer to him, suspected there was a much quieter battle happening inside, between the faith that had carried him into that frozen valley and a feeling growing heavier by the week that his prayers were vanishing into thin air. For a long stretch of time, according to his earliest biographers, he felt exactly what you're feeling right now. That emptiness after prayer, that sense of speaking into a darkness that never answers back. William of Saint-Thierry, one of Bernard's closest friends and his first biographer, wrote that during those years the young abbot went through entire nights of what he called dryness of the soul, a real category in the spiritual life, recognized across centuries of mystical theology. not some dramatic phrase invented to sound impressive. He describes a state in which the soul prays, seeks, strains, and finds no sensible comfort in return. Bernard didn't understand it yet. And like anyone going through that dryness without understanding it, he started asking himself if he was doing something wrong. There's a story his contemporaries preserved with special care, precisely because it captures that moment of fragility right before everything changed. It's said that during one of those nights of dry, empty prayer, Bernard stopped in front of an image of the Virgin in Clairvaux's small chapel. He wasn't asking for anything new that time. He just stayed there, in silence, with no words left to offer because he no longer knew what else to say. And in that silence, something began to shift. Slowly, without the flash of light or the audible voice you hear about in other saints' stories. It was more like fruit ripening than a lamp switching on. Bernard began to understand that the silence he'd been living inside didn't mean what he'd feared it meant. And that understanding, which took years to fully take shape in him, is exactly the piece you need to hold on to right now, because it goes straight to that emptiness you feel when you talk to the Virgin and nobody seems to answer. Because what Bernard discovered in those cold nights at Clairvaux wasn't a prayer technique or some magic formula to force a feeling. It was something deeper, something about the very nature of Mary's love, about how it acts when it chooses to stay quiet. We owe most of that understanding to one specific episode, preserved for centuries by both the Carmelite and Benedictine traditions, passed down from monk to monk by people who knew it was worth holding on to. An episode involving the Virgin, Bernard, and an experience that changed forever the way he understood what it means when she goes silent. I'm not going to tell you that episode yet. The monks who carried it orally for generations before it was ever written into the Cistercian chronicles insisted on something curious, that Bernard, even in old age, even as the most influential preacher in Europe, still told that story with a cracked voice, as if the memory hurt and healed him all at once, every single time he told it. Because before that, you need to understand something else, the difference between two kinds of silence that exist in the spiritual life. One wounds, the other heals, and from the outside, they look exactly the same. That difference is what took Bernard years to learn how to tell apart, and it's very likely the same difference you don't yet know how to recognize in your own prayer life. Have you ever wondered why a mother's silence never means the same thing as a stranger's silence? That question is exactly what Bernard had to learn to answer for himself, and it's the key to understanding what happened to him after that night in the Clairvaux chapel. There are, in the Christian spiritual tradition, two silences that look identical at first glance, but are underneath complete opposites. The first is the silence of abandonment. That one is real. It happens when a soul walks away from God by its own choices, closing doors that he respects, because he respects human freedom, even when that freedom is used badly. That silence hurts because it's a consequence. It's a door the person shut from the inside. The second silence has an entirely different origin, even though it can feel just as painful from inside the heart living through it. It's the silence of a mother watching her child learn to walk without rushing to catch him at every step. A silence rooted in a love that knows how to wait. Something very different from simple distance. Saint John of the Cross, spiritually a contemporary of this whole Carmelite tradition that Saint Teresa of Jesus would later inherit, called it the dark night and explained that God allows that dryness precisely to purify the soul of its need for constant comfort, teaching it to love by faith and not only by feeling. Bernard discovered, without yet having the precise theological language Saint John of the Cross would develop centuries later, that his own silence belonged to this second category. And he discovered it in a very concrete, almost physical way, in an experience his biographers recorded in detail because they understood how important it was. It happened on a particularly harsh winter night. Bernard had been sick for weeks, weakened by fasting, unable to take part in some of the community's daily work. He'd withdrawn to a quiet corner of the church, nearly dark, with a single candle burning in front of a carved image of the Virgin the monks especially venerated. That night he wasn't asking for healing or relief for his exhausted body. He simply started talking to Mary the way you talk to someone you know is present, even if you can't feel it. He told her how tired he was. He told her he was afraid of failing his vocation. He told her, with the brutal honesty that only shows up when there's no strength left to fake spiritual composure, that sometimes he doubted whether she was really listening at all. And then, according to the tradition preserved by the Cistercians, something happened. Something Bernard never described as a dramatic apparition or a flashy supernatural event. It was more intimate than that. He felt, the account says, a sudden certainty, with no words and no visions involved. Just a peace so real that he found it impossible afterward to describe it with the same language he used for his penances or his theology. That certainty told him, without saying it in words, that the silence he'd been living inside was a form of closeness so near that it no longer needed to announce itself with outward signs. The fear of rejection that had followed him for months started to loosen its grip that same night. Bernard walked out of that night changed, though the great Marian preacher history would remember still needed years and a great deal of theological labor to fully take shape. What changed immediately was a new understanding that started seeping into everything he wrote and preached from then on. He began speaking of Mary as a mother whose closeness doesn't depend on her child feeling her at every instant, gradually leaving behind that image of a distant figure you had to beg, afraid of not being heard. Years later, as a respected abbot and advisor to popes and kings, Bernard wrote about this experience with an honesty rare among the great theologians of his time. He never dressed it up as spiritual heroism, never presented it as a trial easily overcome. In words later preserved in his sermons on the Song of Songs, he openly admitted that there are seasons when the soul searches for God and his mother, the way someone gropes through a dark room unable to find the wall that would help them find their bearings, and yet he insisted on something essential to his whole teaching, that darkness doesn't cancel the search. It actually makes it more honest because it strips prayer of all calculation, of every expectation of an immediate reward, and reduces it to what matters most, simply the will to keep searching even when nothing comes back. This is exactly what you need to hear right now, while you feel your own prayers disappearing into a silence you've been reading as rejection. Because the silence you're living, that absence of signs, that lack of any felt peace after praying, might belong exactly to that second category Bernard learned to recognize. It might be the quiet proof of a love that trusts you to stand without needing constant confirmation. Nowhere close to a sign that Mary walked away. But recognizing that difference in your own life isn't automatic. It takes learning to look back and notice signs a heart agitated by anxiety usually misses. Bernard, in his years of maturity, used to advise young monks struggling with the same dryness he'd once lived through to examine what that silence left behind, rather than the silence itself. He'd ask if, despite the aridity, they still made their way to the chapel. He'd ask if, despite feeling nothing, they still said Mary's name every night. That persistence, he said, was the answer they were looking for, even if it never arrived wrapped in the emotion they expected. The cold seeps in under the door and climbs up your ankles. Wax drips slowly onto the stone, and in the middle of that frozen silence, there's a woman kneeling who spent 3 years asking the Virgin for the same thing, without a single sign that she's being heard. That woman could be anyone. She could be the person listening to these words right now. In the years following that inner transformation, Bernard began receiving letters and visits from people going through that exact same darkness. Nobles, peasants, nuns, other abbots, all of them asking in slightly different ways the same question. whether God and his mother had stopped listening to them. And here's where the story gets harder to sit with, because not everyone Bernard counseled came out of that dark night stronger. Some, worn down by waiting for a sign that never came in the shape they expected, walked away from the life of faith altogether. They stopped praying. They stopped receiving the sacraments. Convinced heaven had abandoned them, they decided to abandon it first, the way someone jumps ahead of rejection so they don't have to feel it land. Bernard grieved over several of those cases. There are surviving letters of his, kept in monastic archives, where he expresses genuine sorrow over souls he knew personally who lost their faith at the exact moment they needed it most. And in those letters, one warning shows up again and again, a warning that gets to the heart of what's really at stake when someone misreads divine silence. Here's the warning. The greatest danger isn't going through spiritual dryness. Sooner or later, almost everyone who seriously seeks God ends up walking through it. The danger is in how that dryness gets interpreted while it lasts. Because a soul that reads silence as abandonment starts acting as though it really has been abandoned, and that behavior ends up pulling it away from a grace that's still there, even if it can't be felt. It's a quiet, dangerous mechanism. Someone stops feeling comfort in prayer. They read that emptiness as proof God lived. They stop searching because why keep looking for something you believe is already lost? And that same lack of searching deepens the sense of emptiness, which in turn reinforces the original belief of abandonment. A circle that closes in on itself until it becomes a prison. There's a particular case recorded in the Abbey's chronicles. A widow from the Champagne region who'd lost her only son to an epidemic. For months, she went to the Clairvaux chapel to beg the Virgin for comfort in her grief, never feeling the relief she so badly needed. One day she stopped going. The monks who knew her tried to reach out to ask what had happened, and she answered with a line that was recorded almost word for word, that there was no point talking to someone who had clearly decided never to answer. Bernard heard about it and asked someone to go visit her with a single instruction. Listen first. Don't judge the grief that had brought her to that point. Leave any attempt to convince or correct her for later. That gesture, small as it seems, ended up being the start of a slow process that brought her back to the faith months afterward. She wasn't looking for a spectacular sign anymore. She simply accepted carrying her grief with the same prayer that had once felt useless to her. And over time, she found that comfort arrived little by little, almost without her noticing, in the shape of a calm she hadn't recognized as an answer before. Sit with that for a moment. How many times in your own life has that same logic already started operating without you noticing it? You feel like praying doesn't help. You pray less. You feel even less comfort because you're praying less. And that lack of comfort confirms, in your mind, the original idea that God and Mary aren't listening anymore. Bernard identified this mechanism with astonishing precision for his era. Centuries before modern psychology described similar patterns of self-fulfilling prophecies in other areas of human life. And he proposed something that sounded almost backwards to the anguished people who came looking for quick comfort. Keep praying exactly the same, with the same discipline, even when you feel absolutely nothing. Not as an act of passive resignation, but as an act of active faith that keeps the relationship with God alive, even when the senses don't confirm it in the moment. He compared this kind of perseverance to a son who keeps writing letters to a father away on a long trip, even when the replies take a while to arrive because of how far the letters have to travel. The father's silence during that stretch doesn't mean he's stopped loving his son. It simply means the answer is on its way, even if the son can't see it or hold it yet. That image of the traveling father became so popular among his disciples that it kept turning up with small variations in later sermons from other Cistercian preachers who'd heard it from Bernard himself and repeated it to their own communities as a simple way of explaining something that was otherwise hard to get across to young monks, still impatient for instant comfort in every prayer they said. But there's still one more piece of this story I haven't told you. Something tied directly to what Bernard eventually wrote, years later, about Mary's specific role inside this kind of silence. Because it isn't enough to know you have to persevere. You need to understand why, specifically, she allows that silence to stretch on so long before showing itself in any recognizable way. Look to her, follow her, call on her. That phrase, attributed to Bernard in one of his most quoted Marian sermons across the centuries, sums up an entire theology of silence in barely 3 words, a compression very few preachers have ever managed. Look to her first. Before asking for anything, before expecting any answer, contemplate who she is. Follow her next, with your life, with your daily decisions, not just with words spoken on your knees for 5 minutes a day. And call on her finally, with the confidence of someone who knows they've already been seen and followed before they ever asked for anything. Bernard developed this teaching further in one of his sermons on the Virgin, where he compares her to an aqueduct. The image might sound strange to modern ears, but in the 12th century it carried something very concrete. Just as an aqueduct receives water from a spring and carries it to a thirsty town, without being the source itself, only the channel through which it travels, Mary receives the fullness of divine grace and carries it to every soul that comes near her. And here's the point Bernard develops with particular theological care. An aqueduct doesn't deliver water instantly from the spring to every house in town. There's a journey. There's a stretch of transit invisible to the person waiting at home with an empty jug, during which the water is already moving, even though it hasn't reached the tap yet. Bernard applied this image directly to the experience of silence in prayer. When someone begs Mary for something and doesn't feel an immediate answer, that doesn't mean the aqueduct has run dry or that the spring has stopped flowing. Far more often, it means the grace being asked for is already in transit, traveling a road the human soul can't see and can't rush along with its own anxiety. This teaching rests on solid doctrinal ground beyond the beauty of the image itself. Catholic Marian theology holds that Mary, as mediatrix of all graces, acts according to a wisdom that considers the soul's whole good, far above the logic of human urgency. And that plan isn't exhausted by the immediate resolution of one specific request. This carries something deeply consoling for anyone who feels the Virgin isn't listening. The silence itself might be exactly how she's working on something bigger than what the person managed to ask for in the moment. A wise father doesn't always give his child exactly what he asks for the instant he asks for it. Especially when that father can see consequences the child, with his limited view, can't yet grasp. Bernard insisted this waiting should never be confused with indifference. In another of his surviving writings on the Virgin, he wrote that she watches every tear shed in prayer with an attention no human being could ever match, and that no sincere plea is ever lost in the void, even if its fruit takes time to show itself in a way the soul can clearly recognize. There's an account preserved in the Clairvaux chronicles of a knight from the region who'd lost his land in an unjust dispute with a more powerful noble. For years he went to the monastery asking the Virgin for justice, watching nothing about his situation change. Bernard received him several times, and instead of promising a quick resolution, he taught him the same image of the aqueduct. He explained that the justice he sought might already be on its way, in a form he couldn't yet imagine, and that his job was to keep the jug ready to receive it whenever it arrived, rather than counting the days with anxiety. The knight got part of his land back years later, after a political shift that neither he nor anyone else in the region could have predicted. But what Bernard always highlighted about that story, every time he told it, was the way that man had held on to his faith through the whole stretch of waiting, far more than the happy ending itself. Never abandoning prayer, never turning bitter, even with no certainty that justice would ever come. That capacity to hold on to trust without visible guarantees is, in Bernard's view, the most valuable fruit that well-lived silence produces. The inner transformation of someone who learns to trust without needing constant proof, far more than the exact resolution of the problem in the exact shape it was asked for. There's something else in this teaching that connects directly to what Saint Teresa of Jesus would live through centuries later in her own path of prayer, even though she hasn't fully entered this story yet. Because the Spanish Carmelite, when she faced her own seasons of extreme dryness, documented in astonishing detail in her own writings, found comfort in this exact same image of transit time, of water traveling unseen before it arrives. That connection between the 12th century monk and the 16th century Carmelite reformer belongs to the same spiritual current, the same deep understanding of divine silence passed down through generations of mystics who learned to tell apart the emptiness that destroys from the emptiness that prepares, far beyond any accidental historical coincidence. And that distinction, the one Bernard taught through the image of the aqueduct, is exactly the one you need to apply right now to your own experience of prayer, while you keep waiting for a sign that still hasn't come. The water already left the spring, even though your eyes, tired from staring at an empty tap, still can't see it coming through the underground path it's traveling without anyone watching from the outside. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew this same silence from the inside, long before she became the reformer we venerate today. For years, at the monastery of the Incarnation in Avila, she went through a season of spiritual dryness so intense that she herself described it in harsh terms in her autobiography. In the book of her life, Teresa recounts a long stretch of her religious life, during which mental prayer, that intimate form of communication with God that would later make her famous throughout Christendom, became, for her, a dry, almost painful exercise. She says she'd sit down to pray and feel such inner resistance, such a lack of comfort, that she sometimes would have preferred almost any other task to facing that emptiness. She admits, with the radical honesty running through everything she wrote, that during that time she came to doubt whether her vocation even made sense. She wondered if God had really called her to that life of total surrender, or if she was simply wasting her years shut behind stone walls, getting nothing back for the sacrifice her enclosure represented. This period of Teresa's life is especially valuable for understanding what Bernard had taught centuries earlier, because she didn't just live through the dryness, she later analyzed it with a theological depth very few mystics have ever reached. In her later writings, particularly in The Interior Castle, she develops an entire doctrine on the different stages of prayer and gives considerable space to explaining exactly this kind of aridity. Teresa draws a precise distinction between what she calls natural dryness, which can come from physical tiredness, illness, or simple distraction, and the dryness God deliberately permits as part of the soul's purification. This second kind, she explains, is the hardest to bear precisely because it doesn't respond to any cause the soul can identify or fix on its own. One particularly moving element of her testimony is that through those years of deepest dryness, Teresa never stopped showing up to pray, even though every session cost her enormous effort. She writes that she forced herself to stay the full set time before the Blessed Sacrament or in her cell, even when she felt she was accomplishing nothing, even when the clock seemed to crawl slower than ever during those empty hours of prayer. And here's where something connects directly to Bernard's teaching about the aqueduct. Teresa came to understand, in the maturity of her spiritual life, that those years of aridity hadn't been wasted time. They were, in her own later words, the ground where the spiritual strength was planted that would later let her found 17 Carmelite convents, face fierce ecclesiastical opposition, and sustain a profound life of prayer to the very end of her days. The Saint of Avila would go on to say she'd choose dryness endured with fidelity 1,000 times over sensible comfort given without effort, because in that aridity, held onto with perseverance, something forms that no fleeting comfort can form by itself. A will trained to love God beyond what it feels. There's a particular passage in the book of her life where Teresa describes, in those moments of deepest dryness, taking refuge in a sacred image kept in her cell, remarkably similar in its spiritual function to the carved image Bernard had knelt before 4 centuries earlier at Clairvaux. She writes that at times she'd simply look at that image without saying a word, letting the mere presence of that painted face anchor her when the words of vocal prayer slipped through her fingers like water. She also recounts one specific moment, after years of dryness, when she finally experienced a comfort so intense that she wept with gratitude for hours. But what's revealing about her account is that she herself warns her Carmelite sisters that this comfort didn't arrive as a reward for calculated effort or as payment earned through good spiritual behavior. It came when it wanted, the way it wanted by God's sovereign freedom. And she received it without ever having demanded or expected it at that specific moment. This warning matters enormously for correctly understanding the whole teaching Bernard and Teresa share about divine silence. Neither saint teaches a guaranteed formula that produces sensible comfort if followed with enough discipline. What they teach is something deeper and, in a way, harder for the human heart to accept, so used to chasing measurable results, that fidelity in prayer carries its own value, independent of whether it produces the emotional experience the soul longs for. Teresa wrote that many of her sisters in Carmel came to her anguished for this exact reason, asking what they were doing wrong when prayer turned dry for weeks or months at a time. And her answer, recorded in several of her surviving letters, was always similar. That dryness, far from being a sign of spiritual failure, was very often the stage where God was working most intensely, just in a way the soul couldn't yet perceive or fully understand. This teaching shares the same root as Bernard's, though expressed in the language of 16th century Carmelite mysticism, with its images of interior castles and successive dwelling places instead of medieval aqueducts and springs. Both saints, 400 years apart, belonging to different religious traditions, arrived at the same essential conclusion about divine silence, each from his or her own language, era, and personal experience of the same dark night that every heart sincerely seeking God has to walk through. In a letter Teresa sent to one of her youngest foundations, written during one of the most turbulent stretches of her reforming work, there's a piece of advice that seems written directly for anyone who today feels the Virgin has gone silent in the face of their pleas. She was writing to a newly appointed prioress, anxious because her community was facing severe financial hardship, and their prayers for help seemed to be getting no answer from heaven. Teresa wrote back with the warm firmness that marked her letters, reminding her that she herself had founded several of her convents in the middle of circumstances that looked exactly like scarcity and abandonment, and that in every single one of those cases, divine providence had ended up showing itself in ways nobody could have predicted ahead of time. This pattern repeats over and over in Teresa's life. The founding of St. Joseph's in Avila, her first reformed convent, ran into opposition from civil and religious authorities so fierce that for months it seemed completely impossible it would ever come together. There were legal proceedings, pressure from the town council, resistance from other religious orders eyeing this new form of discalced Carmelite life with suspicion. Teresa prayed, pleaded, begged for intercession, and for long stretches of that process, silence seemed like the only answer available. The surviving historical records of this founding describe tense meetings of Avila's town council, where several councilmen openly argued the city already had enough convents, and that one more, especially one as austere as the one Teresa was proposing, would be an unsustainable burden on the population's resources. The bishop himself hesitated for a while before giving his final approval. There were moments, according to her own letters from that period, when Teresa genuinely wondered whether God actually wanted that foundation, or whether she'd misread some interior sign that had pushed her into an impossible project. And yet, in the middle of that uncertainty, she kept going. She wrote letters to people of influence who might help. She sought financial backing from relatives and friends willing to pitch in. She visited church authorities, patiently explaining her vision of a more austere, more recollected Carmelite life. All the while, heaven, apparently, stayed silent on whether any of that effort would ever bear fruit. And yet the convent was founded. Against every reasonable prediction, against organized opposition from forces that looked far more powerful than a small group of nuns determined to live with greater austerity and recollection. Teresa herself attributed that success, in her own writings, directly to the intercession of Saint Joseph and the Virgin Mary. Help that had stayed invisible through the whole process until it finally showed itself at exactly the right moment, far beyond her own negotiating skill or any lucky coincidence. This experience, repeated throughout her whole life as a founder, taught her something she'd later pass on to her sisters with real clarity: that God's silence during a hard process very often means the opposite of what the anguished soul tends to fear. It means that action is unfolding on a level human eyes can't yet see, preparing conditions, moving wills, arranging circumstances that will only reveal themselves as providential once they finally come to completion. Out of these repeated experiences, Teresa developed a practical spirituality of active waiting, worlds apart from the passive resignation that just sits back and waits for heaven to act. She kept working, she kept negotiating, she kept writing letters and chasing down real support, all while carrying inside her the certainty that her own human effort was woven together with a divine action that wasn't always visible in the moment. This blend of persistent work and quiet faith is, perhaps, the most practical fruit of everything we've explored here, from Bernard to Teresa, holding on to concrete effort and unguaranteed trust at the same time. Nowhere near folding your arms and waiting for the Virgin to fix everything without human cooperation, and just as far from burning yourself out in anxious activity that doesn't trust Providence. Peace comes to whoever knows. The outcome doesn't rest on their strength alone. Near the end of her life, looking back over the whole road she'd traveled from those first dry nights at the Incarnation to the founding of 17 convents across Spain, Teresa wrote that if she'd been able to see ahead of time the fruit those years of aridity would bear, she never would have found the courage to carry them the way she actually did. Precisely because she couldn't see the outcome, she had to learn to walk supported only by faith, a lesson that, in her own words, turned out to be worth more than any sensible comfort she could have received along the way. That late confession reveals something essential about the nature of divine silence, taught by both Bernard and Teresa from very different personal experiences, separated by almost 400 years of church history. Far from being a simple obstacle to get past quickly on the way to real spiritual life, silence is very often the very ground where that spiritual life matures into a depth no constant comfort could have produced. And maybe that's the deepest comfort this whole journey can offer you today. If your own prayer to the Virgin has held steady through the silence, if you've kept going back to the chapel, to the rosary, to the lit candle in front of her image, even feeling nothing, you're already walking the exact same road Bernard walked at Clairvaux and Teresa walked at Avila. A road that, as both of them discovered over time, always leads somewhere, even when that somewhere is still hidden from your tired, waiting eyes. Stop for a moment and look back honestly over the last few months of your life. Don't go looking for a spectacular miracle or a sign that breaks the laws of nature. Look for something smaller, quieter. The kind of thing a heart shaken by anxiety usually overlooks without giving it a second thought. This is exactly the exercise Bernard recommended to the monks who came to him convinced the Virgin had abandoned them. And it's the same one Teresa suggested to her Carmelite sisters whenever dryness made them doubt their vocation. Both agreed that Mary's answers rarely arrive with the noise the human imagination expects. They arrive almost always with the quiet of someone who doesn't need to be noticed to act. Did you get unexpected help from someone with no particular reason to help you? Did you find, in the middle of a crisis, a calm you couldn't quite explain, a strength to keep going that went beyond your own natural strength? Did a solution show up for a problem you'd been stuck on for months, right when you'd already stopped actively looking for it? Think about this too. Was there ever a moment when you avoided, without really knowing why, a decision that later turned out disastrous for someone else who did take it? Did you feel, at some important crossroads in your life, a sudden hesitation that made you change course just in time, without being able to explain that instinct rationally? Many people discover, looking back with a clear head, that the Virgin acted precisely by preventing something, not only by granting something. Invisible protection is just as real as a favor granted, even though it's much harder to recognize, because you can't measure what never got the chance to happen. Those small signs, easy to write off as coincidence, are exactly what Bernard taught people to recognize as the fingerprints of an intercession working in silence. They rarely show up as direct answers to the exact request you made. Sometimes they arrive disguised as inner strength, as unexpected patience, as a door opening somewhere completely different from where you were looking. Teresa wrote about this using a particularly beautiful image in the interior castle. She compared the soul to a garden and God to the gardener who waters it in different ways, depending on each plant's stage of growth. At first, she said, the gardener has to haul water up by hand from a deep well with great effort. Later, he can use a water wheel that makes the work easier. After that, a river that waters on its own. And finally, rain that God sends directly, with no work from the gardener at all. This progression, Teresa explained, doesn't mean the earlier stages are lesser or that the garden gets less water at the start. It means the way that water arrives changes with the soul's maturity, and that confusing the absence of visible effort with the absence of water is a mistake many souls make when they judge their own spiritual life. There's something especially comforting in this image of the garden, because Teresa insists that none of the 4 ways of watering is morally superior to the others. The soul still hauling water up by hand, tired and straining, is no farther from God than the soul already receiving rain without any visible work at all. It's simply a different stage of the same road, and every stage carries its own dignity, its own formative value. Plenty of people get discouraged comparing their own prayer life to someone else's, who seems to receive comfort more easily, without understanding that each soul walks this process at its own pace, set by God's wisdom, and not by any formula that applies the same way to everyone. Applied to the Virgin's silence weighing on you today, this means something very concrete. Maybe the help you asked for didn't arrive in the shape of the well, with the visible hands-on effort you expected to see. Maybe it arrived as the water wheel, some quieter mechanism working without you having to watch it turn. Or maybe, and this is the hardest to recognize, it arrived as rain, so natural, so woven into your everyday life, that you never even identified it as an answer to your plea. Bernard and Teresa agree on one last practical piece of advice here. Keep a record, even just a mental one, of the small signs that show up after a season of sustained prayer, with the goal of training your heart to recognize the subtle pattern providence tends to follow, far more than forcing a miraculous reading onto every daily coincidence. That pattern gets easier to see the more you practice paying attention to the small details of everyday life. Because the question we opened with, that doubt about whether the Virgin really listens when you talk to her, is about to find its full answer. And that answer isn't the one you were probably expecting when you started listening to this. There's still one last piece of this story that Bernard wrote down near the very end of his life by then the most influential preacher in all of Western Christendom, advisor to popes, founder of dozens of monasteries, and still able to remember with perfect clarity that cold night at Clairvaux, when he still knew nothing of what he'd later come to understand about a mother's silence. That memory, kept for decades and passed down carefully to his closest disciples, became the key that let him accompany all the troubled souls who kept coming to him afterward, asking for the same answer you're looking for today. On August 20th, the day the Church honors the memory of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, his closest disciples used to gather to read aloud one specific passage from his Marian writings, the one they considered the final summary of everything their teacher had learned about Mary's silence over an entire lifetime of prayer and preaching. That passage describes an experience Bernard had as an old man, just a few years before he died, during one of his last retreats at Clairvaux, long past the constant travel he'd once done across Europe, preaching the crusade, mediating conflicts between kings, and defending Catholic doctrine against heresies threatening to split Christendom apart. During that retreat, according to his closest biographers, Bernard spent several nights in prolonged prayer in front of the very same image of the Virgin that had marked the start of his spiritual transformation decades earlier, back when he was still a young monk tormented by dryness. And on one of those nights, he felt, with a clarity he described as the deepest of his entire life, that he finally understood, completely, the meaning of that first silence he'd lived through so long ago. He understood that the silence he'd faced at the beginning hadn't been, as he'd feared for years, divine indifference. It had been the first step of a formation that would stretch across his whole life, a formation that later equipped him to accompany thousands of troubled souls, exactly as troubled as he himself had once been in his youth. If Mary had answered him right away with the sensible comfort he'd asked for during those first nights, he never would have developed the spiritual depth needed to become the mellifluous doctor the Church would remember for centuries. The silence, Bernard finally understood, had been the very instrument that forged his vocation, a built-in part of it, as necessary as any other piece of his spiritual formation, nowhere close to being a simple obstacle he'd had to overcome on the way to that vocation. This final understanding connects directly to what Teresa of Jesus would discover centuries later on her own path, when she recognized that those years of dryness at the Incarnation in Avila had been exactly the ground where the strength was formed that would later let her stand against fierce opposition to her reforming work, hold spiritual conversations of astonishing depth, and write texts that still guide millions of souls toward God today. Both saints, the 12th century French monk and the 16th century Spanish Carmelite, arrive at this same final truth, the answer to the question that's carried this whole journey. The Virgin does listen, always, without exception, to every word spoken with sincere faith, even when the silence that sometimes follows that word can feel like absence. That silence, far from meaning rejection, is very often the space where she works with the greatest care, preparing something in the soul that no immediate answer could have prepared the same way. Your own prayer, the one you feel is disappearing tonight into the void, with no answer, no visible comfort, might be sitting inside that exact same process right now. It might be right now, while you're reading or listening to these words, the well Bernard talked about, the one that demands effort and patience before it becomes a river. Or it might already be the water wheel, working in a way you don't fully recognize yet. What Bernard and Teresa teach, with the authority of 2 whole lives given over to this same mystery, is that none of those stages means abandonment. The Virgin who seemed to stay silent for years in front of a tormented young monk at Clairvaux ended up shaping him into the sweetest saint the Church has ever known. The same Virgin who seemed to stay silent in front of a Carmelite nun in Avila ended up shaping her into the reformer who transformed contemplative Catholic life forever. And that same Virgin, with that same silent, patient faithfulness, is working right now in you, even if you still can't see it clearly. Think about what that means for your own story. Every night, you've kept praying without feeling any comfort. Every rosary finished with a heavy heart instead of the peace you were hoping for. Every time you've knelt down without receiving any visible sign. All of it belongs to the same process Bernard described with the image of the aqueduct, and that Teresa described with the image of the garden watered little by little. None of those nights were wasted, even if in the moment it felt exactly like they were. There's one last teaching both saints share, maybe the most practical of all. The certainty that this silence, sooner or later, transforms, though almost never in the exact way or at the exact time you would have wanted. Heidi. Bernard, after that final night of understanding at Clairvaux, lived out his last years with an inner peace his own disciples noticed and described as radically different from the anguish of his early days in the monastery. Teresa, near the end of her life, wrote that she'd finally learned to easily tell apart the silence that purifies from any other lesser form of dryness. A discernment that took her decades to build, but that ended up giving her a deep peace in her final years. That same transformation is available to you, with no special technique required, no secret formula Bernard or Teresa kept just for a chosen few. What both of them practiced their whole lives simply was this: perseverance in prayer, trust that the silence has a purpose even when that purpose isn't visible yet, and the humility to accept that God's timing rarely lines up exactly with ours. You came into this carrying a question that ached quietly, that feeling of talking to the Virgin and sensing your words falling into a bottomless well. And now, as you finish listening to this, something in your chest has loosened a little, even if you can't put an exact name to that relief yet. You met a young French monk who felt that exact same emptiness on the cold nights of Clairvaux, long before he became the saint the Church would remember as the gentlest of all who ever wrote about Mary. You watched his dryness turn into the quiet ground where the tenderness he'd later pour out over all of Christendom was planted, nowhere near punishment, nowhere near abandonment. And you walked alongside, even from a distance, a Spanish Carmelite who lived through her own dark night behind the walls of the Incarnation, doubting her vocation, feeling like God had left, until those arid years became the root of a strength that would found 17 convents and change the history of contemplative life forever. You learned something maybe nobody had ever explained to you quite this clearly. There are two deeply different silences, even though they feel identical from inside the heart living through them. One wounds because it's the result of a real distance. The other heals, forms, prepares, even though it hurts just the same while you're living through it. You discovered the image of the aqueduct, of water already on its way, even though your tired eyes still can't see it reach the tap. And you discovered Teresa's garden too. That garden watered sometimes with effort, sometimes with a gentle rain that arrives without anyone having to ask for it. If you feel today that the Virgin isn't listening to you, you're not carrying that doubt the same way you were carrying it when you started. Now you know that Bernard and Teresa lived through exactly what you're living, with the same anguish, the same nights of praying and feeling nothing back. And you know that both of them, over the years, discovered that silence was never rejection. It was the quiet space where a mother works with a care only she understands, forming in the soul something no immediate answer could have formed the same way. Staying with this all the way to this point, instead of turning it off the moment it felt like there wasn't going to be a quick fix, was already in itself a small act of that same perseverance both saints taught with their entire lives. And that, small as it seems, isn't nothing. It's exactly the kind of quiet faithfulness that, as they both came to understand, ends up being heard, even if the fruit takes time to show itself in a way you can finally see. You're carrying something now that you didn't have before. The quiet certainty that your own prayer, the one still rising every night even without a visible sign, is part of the same road walked by two of the greatest hearts the Church has ever known. Before we say goodbye, there's one more thing about what happened to that widow from Champagne who stopped praying when the grief over her son became unbearable, because her story didn't end where I left it. Months after Bernard sent someone to visit her, asking nothing of her, rushing nothing, she went back to the chapel by her own choice on an ordinary Sunday with nobody calling her that day in particular. And what brought her back wasn't a spectacular sign or an instant answer to her oldest plea. It was something much smaller. The simple habit of walking up to the monastery door each week, until one day she crossed the threshold almost without thinking, like someone picking back up a road that had never stopped waiting for her. There are stories like this in every era, in every corner of the spiritual tradition you've walked through today. Souls who drifted away for a while, convinced heaven had forgotten them, who later discovered the road back was always open, waiting for the moment they'd decide to walk it again. Some of those stories involve other saints, other nights of dryness, other ways the Virgin and her son worked in silence before finally showing themselves in ways nobody expected. If any of what you heard today touched something in you, if you felt this journey was speaking directly to your own experience of prayer and silence, there are almost certainly other stories waiting for you. Stories of other saints who walked through similar trials and left behind lessons just as concrete about how to hold on to faith when everything seems to say no one is listening. Stories about telling the difference between God's voice and the noise of your own anxiety. Stories about what happens in a soul when it finally surrenders to trust after years of struggle. Every one of those stories was kept with the same care this one was kept for you today, waiting for the exact moment someone would need to hear it. Maybe that moment is now for you as you finish this and feel that quiet curiosity to know what else is out there. What other lessons the saints left about the questions still keeping you up at night, about your loved ones who've passed, about your family, about your own path toward eternity. There's something deeply human in that curiosity, and it has nothing to do with vanity or idle curiosity. It's the same thirst that drove Bernard to write so many sermons on Mary, the same thirst that drove Teresa to write thousands of pages on the soul's interior road. Both of them understood that a lesson kept only for yourself loses most of its fruit. That's why they wrote. That's why they preached. That's why, centuries later, their words are still reaching people like you, in a time and place they could never have imagined. Maybe your story with prayer looks more like that widow's, the one who stopped praying and slowly came back. No announcements, no big decisions, just a habit picked back up little by little. Or maybe it looks more like the quiet struggle Bernard carried for years before he finally understood what he understood. Or maybe your road has more in common with Teresa's determined perseverance, the one who kept working, kept trusting, even while heaven seemed to stay silent over every foundation she took on. Whatever your story is, there's more waiting to be discovered. Other saints, other dark nights turned into light, other concrete lessons for holding on to faith in the exact moments you need it most. The same curiosity that brought you this far, the one that kept you listening instead of turning it off, is what can keep guiding you toward whatever your soul needs to hear next, right now, at this point in your journey. You don't need to know exactly what you're looking for. Sometimes it's enough to just let yourself keep going, with the same open heart you carried into this today, trusting that whatever comes next will be a continuation of the same quiet thread Providence has been weaving since the first minute you started listening to this story, far beyond simple coincidence. Think about how many times, across your life, a single sentence heard at just the right moment completely changed how you faced a hard season. Think about how many times a lesson that seemed meant for someone else turned out to be exactly what your own soul needed in that precise instant. that same thing could be waiting for you now, in the next story, in the next lesson Providence sets in front of you without you having to go looking for it. Remember, too, that neither Bernard nor Teresa arrived at this understanding by reading one single isolated lesson. It was a long road built out of many nights of prayer, many stories turned over again and again, many returns to look at the same mystery of divine silence from a different angle until it finally became clear. You're on that same road too, and every story you hear adds one more stone to that understanding, being built up slowly, almost without you noticing. Stay a little longer. Let the same peace you started feeling while listening to this stay with you into whatever comes next. Because just as the Virgin's silence was never abandonment, this pause doesn't have to be the end of the road you started walking today, a little more clearly than before. And now, before I let you go, I want to stay with you a moment longer in silence, like someone walking a friend to the door without rushing the goodbye. In one of the last things Bernard wrote about Mary, he left behind a line that sums up everything we've walked through together today, that no one ever asks her in vain, even when the answer takes its time showing up in the way the heart is hoping for. That line, written almost 900 years ago by a monk who knew dryness as closely as you know it today, is still just as true now as it was then. Carry that certainty with you the next time you kneel down tonight or tomorrow, or whenever you next feel the need to talk to the Virgin without knowing if anyone's listening on the other end. She listens. She always listens. And even if the silence goes on, even if the sign you're waiting for still hasn't come, that silence might be exactly the one Bernard learned to recognize as a love that waits, as water already traveling toward you. May Saint Teresa of Jesus, who knew that same dark night so well, intercede for you in the moments when faith feels heaviest to carry. May Saint Bernard, the mellifluous doctor, walk with you with the same sweetness he spent his whole life teaching about Mary's motherly love. And may the Virgin, who never once stopped listening to you, even when it felt like she had, cover you tonight with her silent, faithful mantle, the same one that covered a young monk at Clairvaux and a Carmelite in Avila, until both of them understood, each in their own time, that they were never alone. May God bless you, may Mary walk with you, and may this silence weighing on your heart tonight soon become the peace you've been searching for all along.